Welcome back to New Day Northwest, an issue that is roiling our country right now. The impact of racism on people's daily lives can be hard to fully grasp if you haven't actually lived it. Erika Pablo from the Seattle Office for Civil Rights talked to us recently to get a better grasp on the layers of structural racism.
I just want to say it's impossible to have a conversation about racism without acknowledging that the city of Seattle exists on stolen land that's been was originally occupied by the Duwamish. It's important to talk about that history when we go into racism. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But oftentimes we're taught that racism is on an individual level. The idea that it's using a derogatory slur or refusing to serve someone. But racism is way more complex than that. Racism exists every facet of our society, right? It's regard to access to education, the impacts of COVID, access to housing, freedom from policing. And another term for this is called structural racism, or the historical existing policies and practices that benefit white people over people of color.
This is hard, I think, for some people to grasp that the system's kind of been built on a series of assumptions and decisions that were made, some of which may seem abstract to us in current times, right, but really date back for centuries. And I think making that real involves kind of talking about how people are legitimately affected by it when they go out in the world for housing, for a job, for those kinds of things. Can you kind of break it down in that way?
Yeah, I can give an example around wealth gap and housing. So the system of wealth building in our country and housing are very much correlated throughout the US. And just for an example, white households have 10 times more wealth than Black households. And this statistic has been the same since the early 1950s, right? And most people build wealth from home ownership. But access to home ownership hasn't been the same, and it has been historically racialized. So even here in Seattle, neighborhoods there were systemic policies that prohibited or restricted the sale of homes in certain neighborhoods for Blacks, for Jews, for Asians, and other people of color.
Let's talk about policing. We're in this really fast-moving time where, at least for someone my age, things feel different than they have before. I don't know how it feels to you, so I'll ask. But where are we? Where do you think we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue around wealth and housing is not separate from the current protests against police brutality and the call to center Black lives right now. I think many Black and brown folks have experienced over-policing in their communities for decades, and it has to be with where they live, which neighborhoods they live in. And I guess to bring it more current, where we are right now, especially here in Seattle, Seattle has the most progressive accountability laws in the country, right? Like we're one of two, I think, with our reform laws. But just over the past 2 weeks, it's shown us that's not enough. That's not enough. And what many Black leaders and organizers are asking for right now is reinvestment in their communities, right? To have better access to housing and education and healthcare, all these things. And just the autonomy to be able to support themselves in ways that actually make them feel safe. Right?
Can you explain the psychological effect of growing up, for example, in an over-policed community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it impacts. There's statistics, and we're seeing that with COVID, right? I think there's been over 100,000 Black folks that have passed away from COVID. But I think over time, it just deteriorates your mental health and your physical health. Just being even aware of that trauma or that fear that happens, to know that the police aren't necessarily there to protect you. And I think, the police force across the country, and especially here in Seattle, they're kind of not equipped to help folks with mental health crises or folks that are experiencing houselessness, and so a lot of these organizers are asking for, what would it look like if, a family member was experiencing a mental health crisis? You could call up someone, a mental health therapist, professional, they would come to your door and support you during that crisis. Or same for someone experiencing houselessness. You could call up the city government. They would have a safe place to sleep and food to eat. that night? What would that look like? What if we invested in something like that? And that's what they're envisioning. And a lot of those folks are youth, Black and brown youth, that are asking for this and organizing out there.
So what do you think the future looks like? Where would you like to see us go? How do we get started?
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time. I've been, trying to push for legislation and issues for this for a while now. So I'm a little excited that it's part of the normal conversation for folks.
So do you have that feeling too, like there's something happening?
Definitely. I mean, for me as a Black woman, it has been very heavy. It's definitely been very heavy, but there's this light sense along with that, right? There's that hope for future. And I think it's really important for white folks and non-Black people of color to really not always necessarily lean on their Black friends or their family members to educate them. But there's so many resources out there. There's so many resources and books, even our department. So again, the City of Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative, we have a website, we have resources. And there's University of Washington, they have a history project on the segregation of Seattle. If you're interested in learning more about our history, there's documentaries out there. There's a bunch that folks can, just try to educate themselves and learn more about like what's not taught to us in our schools.
And piecing that together so that we understand history and that current that runs through it from the beginning.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, whether you have debt right now or not, it's a tough time for a lot of people and a good time to look at your budgeting. What one financial counselor says we all need to think about right now after this break.